Okay, in this video what we're going to deal with is one of the Harbor Freight heavy duty trailers is a basis for a flatbed, and it's also going to be the basis for a modular building system where basically we can build sections of a building at our convenience and then haul them to the off-grid location pieces at a time. It's a 4x8 framework here. I can expand that out a little bit, so it's going to end up being around a 5x10 framework. Not super heavy duty, but it's going to be fine for hauling our lightweight building sections and occasional heavy loads, as long as we're not doing it, you know, all day, every day at high speed. Low cost type of a basis. A lot of people are building little bug out trailers and stuff like that out of these things. So, on to the flatbed building project. This is one of my more ambitious assembly videos. And we're going to hop back and forth a little bit on this. But this is one of the Hallmaster Harbor Freight utility trailer kits. And it comes in 2 big boxes. If you get this shipped in from Harbor Freight, you're quite likely to see box damage. I bought this at a Harbor Freight store. So, you know, we got it out of the storeroom. If any little parts fall out of it, I can go back and get it right with these guys. Now, there's a couple of ways you can do these, and what I'm going to do in this video is pretty much just the by-the-book assembly on it. It's rated at just under 1 ton, and that's mainly because of the axle. It's basically a 1-ton axle. But then they have it's the weight of the trailer counts against that too. So I think the trailer is rated at 1850 pounds or something, and the reason for that is the weight of the trailer components. So whenever you're stacking stuff on there, it's you know, everything comes off of that axle, including the weight of the trailer itself. These are used in a lot of projects and a lot of stuff, a lot of homemade type projects, and they're pretty decent. You get the heavy duty version, it's all powder coated, and one of the issues I ran into is in welding one of these, you have to grind a lot of that powder coat off to get it to weld, to be able to weld it. What I'm going to be doing on this build today is I'm going to bolt it together the way the factory specification is, and then I'm going to have a welded superstructure that goes on top of that. And I'm going to be making this into a flatbed that's slightly larger than the 4x8 that the trailer normally comes in. So what you'll do is you get through your boxes, kind of make sure you got everything here. We're going to run into some things. We'll talk about it as it goes. And then the wheels and stuff are in here. Next stage will be the layout for the first few parts. So this is what everything looks like unpacked and laid out, which I suggest doing. Kind of count for your parts, but it's probably all there, unless, you know, a box really ruptured and had a problem in transit. If you are going to lose something in transit, it's probably going to be some of those smaller red pieces or some of that stuff that's associated with the fenders. And to be entirely honest with you, some of that fender associated stuff with those fenders, a lot of people don't use that. If you're building a flatbed, a lot of times you might use it. It depends on whether you're doing what type of project it is. So this is basically your parts layout. The hubs with the tires and everything pretty much come pre-assembled. So all you're going to be doing is putting those onto the axle, and then putting the axle nut in with the little cotter pin, and that's that. They're pre-greased and everything. One upgrade you could do is change out that center cap for one that has a lube fitting on it, so you can grease that from time to time. You'll see another video I had where one of these things self-destructed on the freeway. You'll be looking at this, and we'll be identifying the parts here in the next segment. But basically that's what it looks like unpacked, and that's both boxes. So, you know, both boxes will just be going to recycle. They're not good for anything else once they've arrived. Okay, so laying out the tools for this, you got to realize these come from the metric part of the world. And so for the little bolt and lock nut that's used on a lot of the framework assembly here, it's basically, there's a 1 millimeter difference on these. and it uses a 16 millimeter. Now when you go and get like your Sears Craftsman wrench sets and stuff, a lot of American market metric, it's not going to have a 16 millimeter. So I had to go to the back to my Chinese stuff because my Sears Craftsman kit didn't have a 16 millimeter in it. And then I went and I checked on the gear wrench kit. That didn't have a 16 millimeter. So when we look at this stuff, it's 16 millimeter on the nut, and then 16 on the bolt, and then 17 millimeter on the lock nut. There's no washers involved with these because again, it's a nylon lined lock nut. So what I like to do, rather than have the entire wrench sets out, is I just get out the tools that I need. So you're going to be using 16 and 17 millimeter. I found a 17 millimeter socket, but not a 16, so that's going to be used with that. I'm going to use this for the instances where I don't want to ratchet this, because if you use an impact on one end and the ratcheting one on the other, can really beat up your ratcheting wrench, although they have a warranty, right? So that's what it's for. There's a smaller number of larger ones here, and the larger ones are going to be using a 21 and 22. So it's a 22 millimeter on the nut. I got to look through my stuff. I don't think I had a 22 millimeter socket. So, and then it's a 21 millimeter on the bolt. And so that's how that works with that setup. And chances are you're going to be using a hammer on this somewhere, so I bring the hammer. So on layout, we've got the first 4-foot section, basically 2 of the side channels, a couple of the cross beams. The one with the little tabs on there, you'll see the purpose they serve when we get to putting the whole, the hitch and the V-hitch reinforcement together. What you're going to look for on the orientation on these, because it's possible to put them in upside down or backwards, is you want the open channel on the middle one facing the rear, although that's not at all critical. But on the rear one, you need the open channel facing forward, because when we put the other 4-foot section on, they get bolted together, and you need to be able to have those facing each other. If you're doing a weld build on this, then that's not going to matter a hell of a lot either. So if you get the orientation wrong on those, you find out you got to put mostly together, don't take it all the way apart. Well, there's a way you can adapt it. As far as the front to rear orientation on the side channels, what you're going to look for are these little mounting points here that are actually for some of the side marker lights, versus those mounting points which are going to have to do with this suspension mounting. So you'll see it's a 3-hole system. The part with the 2 holes, right, is going to be up when we do this. So that's basically how that goes. The part with the 2 holes will be upward, and that's how it works. The part with those notches there, that's downward, because that's going to be on the lower section of the trailer. We're going to be putting bolts basically high and low. I'm going to use an impact driver to get those in, but what we do on that is you got to kind of reach up in there with a wrench to stop the nut, right? And once they're in, they're kind of, you can loosen it to make some adjustments. I kind of do this in a 2-stage thing. If you're doing a weld build, a lot of times all you're going to do is you're going to put the bolts in there, let it jiggle, and then weld everything. You're not going to put the nuts in all of them. Or you would just put the nuts in one side, let's say the upper or just the lower, and then weld it. And once you've welded it, you can take the bolts and nuts back out, use them on another project. A little bit of an issue here. You're going to run into a situation whether you want to put the bolts in from like this, which I think is how the instructions go, or like this. And remember, this is basically the back of the front piece, so these pieces would be going in here if that's like that. So there's a couple of ways that can go. One, this is the bottom. I like to have it like this so that I can see if that's backed out any. On the top, if you're going to make this like a flatbed trailer, this is the part where welding comes in. okay? Because if you'll see how the C channel works, and then the other is kind of like a C channel plus a tab, right? So that kind of makes it nearly impossible to get a socket into that side. So basically, if you're using an impact wrench, you got to get the impact out here. And like I said, we don't have a lot of the 16 millimeter sockets. So we were holding this, then we put the wrench around to the underside. That's pretty much the only way you're going to get that, is you got to get that wrench around to the underside. As you tighten that with an impact, that's going to start feeling stuck. If you're trying to get the nut on a shaft of the bolt on there, it's a lot of wrestling to do it like they show in the instructions. If you put the stuff on this, then these things are all sticking up and going to be in your way when you try to put decking on the trailer and screw or bolt it down. And there's a few ways that's done. One of them is you could just lay a 4x8 sheet of anything on there, and then screw it down with self-tapping screws. They you know, especially with they have wide head on them. The self-tapper just go in, they get into the metal, they dig all the way in. You've got a flatbed trailer right away. What I'm going to do is I'm going to be building this trailer up so that I have a larger bed than a 4x8, because the problem is this is exactly 4x8. So if you put decking on here and then anything for sides, or use the pre-made slots for your sides, then you can't fit 4x8 material on there, because anything that goes inward a little bit on that means it's going to be too small for 4x8 material, which is one of the problems I ran into on my older trailer. So to carry the 4x8 material, I really needed, like with the sides and everything on there, to be larger than 4x8. So like, you know, I could get my fingers in there with gloves on and everything and pull that stuff back out of the trailer. It's one of the things to deal with on that. So when I do that, I kind of prefer to have the bolts sticking out. Now the other thing I'm running into is I thought these were all the same length, which I still kind of think they are, but as I tighten all this down, you can see some stick out more than others. Well, a lot of it has to do with the fact that this C channel here isn't really precision, okay? So when you're hitting that with the heavy duty impact, it actually pinches that steel in and kind of shapes it in. And once everything's tightened down, this thing stiffens up. But even when it's fully built, it stays a little bit loose. There's a little looseness to it. And so even if you tighten those up, you know, a little zigzag to the thing, a little unsquareness until you shove everything in and straighten it all out. And that's at the point when you do the welding. Because if you want a flat top, the other thing to do is to take a little hand grinder, like here I got this Ryobi. You know, I would take it. You got to clean that powder coating off. You can. A lot of times you can weld through paint, but you can't really weld through powder coating. It just doesn't work out well. But take a dip, cut along there, just enough to get all the powder coating out of there, clean that metal out, and then make a weld. Immediately after that, you want to paint over that, because that'll be an entry point for the rust and corrupt your powder coating. Oh yeah, little bonus item in the video. It's a repurposed South African tactical vest. It becomes my handyman, my electrician tool belt, which, you know, I'll show on some other stuff. And then there's the carpenter tool belt there. But we're going to get this thing built as we go on. I'm taking a lot of breaks. I had to recharge the camera, so I've been posting online and screwing around as I take a few breaks. The actual work time on putting one of these together, once you've done one or two of them, it isn't going to take a hell of a lot longer than it takes to watch a video once you have all the parts laid out. Okay, so at this stage, everything gets laid upside down. The two square subframes get laid up against each other. They may not be totally square, but there's still enough flexibility in this to shove it square as I'm getting the other parts put on. So you notice it's not quite square yet. There is some flexibility to it. Don't worry about making it square at this stage. You'll be dealing with that when you put some of the axle assembly subframe pieces on. And basically, as you tighten those bolts down, it will force it to go square. One thing that will happen at this stage too is these bolts right here get removed so you can put that subframe on. But as I'm doing some other assembly, I prefer those to be in place. So we had put those in. We are going to be taking them back out. The other thing is, one of these little subframe cross beams I put in upside down. It's actually a little better to do it that way if you're using self-tapping screws to hold down decking. That way you don't hit the hole and then you don't have a screw going in nowhere. Not absolutely necessary. Whether or not these cross beams are upside down or right side up isn't really that big of an issue unless you're using the factory state kit. But this one obviously needs to be oriented so that it will hold the some of the other stuff. But most of the rest of the assembly at this stage happens with the whole trailer upside down. And it's still going to be lightweight enough that you can flip it back straight before you start putting whatever structure you want on top. And at this stage, obviously, it's your 4 foot by 8 foot. If you're going to make a short trailer, then this is also one of the stages where you got to think through your modifications. Your tongue arm assembly comes off of these bolts, so you can't cut that much shorter than there. And your axle frame assembly starts here and goes back to about here. So if you're going to use it, make this into a shorter trailer, maybe a little more off-road capable. What you're going to want to do is you're going to orient this one where the open channel faces the other way, and then you're going to cut it off at the back and just discard this rear section. If you're into doing some welding, what you would possibly be able to do, save some of this metal and use it to reinforce some stuff in here. For a little upcoming project, we're talking about building a water container carrier. The problem with using a 4x8 tote on one of these is that if a 300-gallon 4x4 water tote, if a 300-gallon tote is full, it blows over the weight limit of what this trailer can handle by about 600 pounds. So you got to keep that in mind. If I make one of these into a water carrier, it's going to be over our weight limit. So if we're carrying water in it, we just got to make sure never to fill it up all the way. Okay, so this works a little better with this thing set up on the side, and I'm doing this for convenience. I don't like bending over to work. So the other way I've done this in the past is to set the whole thing up on sawhorses. But here's the thing about setting up on the side. Remember that sledgehammer that I had out earlier? This is one of the parts where it comes in useful. As long as your concrete slab you're working on and the ground you're working on is pretty level, I prefer doing this on a concrete slab. As long as it's relatively level. When you set this up on its side and start getting these things in place, yeah, the bolts can pull it straight, but sledgehammering this so that these things straighten out and you get a flatness here, a little sledgehammer action kind of helps on that, okay? Now remember the other part where I was talking about, oops, what if you do this upside down? There are times you may want to do it that way on purpose. What you would do is you would reorient this wherever you want it. Let's say you did reorient it further forward, which in theory you could do. You're just doing a weld build, you're reorienting this a little bit further forward. Probably not going to mess with the assembly here where that stuff's done. And then what you would do is you would weld along all of this. But remember, clean that up with a grinder. The bolts that we took out of here, we're using one of them right here. But if you go through your bolt bags, you're going to find a couple in the secondary bag that are the same head size and everything as the ones that we're using on all that frame assembly, but it's a little bit longer. See how that one's a little bit longer? It uses the same nuts, but what it is that one goes underneath. That one goes here. And remember what I was talking about, how this thing pulls itself straight as you tighten everything down. One goes here, one goes here. That's where you use the longer ones. You can use one of the standard shorter ones here that came out of the other stuff. The other thing is, it's getting a little bit more important to make sure you're using full strength ones. So with these little nylon washers in here, the little lock ones, try to use fresh ones when you're working in this, unless you're doing a weld build. And then at that point, you'll put the stuff in reasonably tight just to cinch it all up. weld it, then take them back out. And you don't have to weld every single line here. You can see what was done on the factory welds on the parts. They're not huge welds, okay? It's a little bit of a stretch to do this with one of the cheaper wire feed welders, but a low-end stick welder, just fine. Okay, just fine. It'll be plenty strong, and you'll be just fine. If you are making, we're later on going to do that shorter water trailer. I'll show you some more modifications on this. But for this series of video, all I'm doing is a standard, regular factory specification build. Here in your little bolt box kit, you're going to find some that are like this. Okay, it's a one-way, one-sided deal. These go into square holes. They'll lock themselves in, whether you put it in from this side or that side. Kind of a personal preference on that. I really kind of prefer to go where I can see the nut when I'm inspecting from the outside. So I'm going to put it in like this and then have it come on the outside. The one that goes under here, I prefer to go from the top down just because I can get to this with the impact wrench. And then if that nut falls out, I still have that bolt sitting in there. It's still going to give me a little bit of strength. On the other hand, once that lock nut's cinched down, it's not going anywhere. And whether you're doing a weld build or a bolt build, I suggest putting these all in and cinching them down and leaving them there on this, and this. Okay, part of where the sledgehammer might need to come in useful, and I'm pulling some bolts back out, is getting some of the trailer tongue mounting brackets in. So I had to take one out. We're going to use one of the slightly longer ones at the rear, shorter one at the front. If you're doing a weld build, I would go ahead and just securely weld all of that. If you're doing a shortened trailer, it is possible at this stage to check your measurements, move this bracket all the way up to here, and then securely weld everything in place for a shorter, more robust trailer, let's say for something that's going to be carrying a water tote. At this stage, we're going to keep going. Okay, so we got those brackets in. I had to flip that one around so you can see how the orientation is on that, how that needs to go. These are your trailer trunk pieces. Part of what makes this a heavier duty trailer than the others is it's got two of them going forward in a V shape as opposed to one going up the middle. There are some people that would modify the design on this and have one going totally front to rear, which is what people do on the boat trailer modification. Here you'll also see the data plate. When you buy one of these from the Harbor Freight store, they're also going to give you basically a certificate of origin. The manufacturer on this is not you. It's a company out of China. Okay, these are mass produced in China, so it's a certificate of origin for a vehicle. In the state of Oregon, there is no further registration needed. Small trailers in Oregon don't get plates. In other states, they do. And so it would work with all of this on a data plate. So the state of Oregon, this doesn't fully count as a vehicle. Other states it does. So there is a VIN number, there is other stuff. It says it's a trailer, it says it's made in China. No matter how much you modify it, apparently it's still made in China. The weight here is also a little differently from what's advertised on the stuff. So basically here, on a data plate, 1980 pounds, I mean basically they're saying it's a 1-ton trailer, compensating partially for the weight of the trailer itself. And, give or take a little bit. So if you're really going to be pushing the limits at a full ton on this thing, definitely don't go full highway speed. The tires, they say, are rated at 55 miles an hour and of course 80 psi, so it's a high pressure tire. Anyway, we'll keep going on this, and then on these mounting things, it's a swing up type of assembly. So we've got bolts that are going to go into here, a quick release pin. No, I'm sorry, I think it's bolts on both of these, and then a quick release pin here. And the location of that kind of depended on which trailer you're putting together, because they use the same parts in other kits. But putting the trailer tongue assembly and the hitch assembly together, that's kind of complex. We'll get on that next. something to be aware of here. The nut and bolts you're going to use here are these larger ones. It's 21 and 22 millimeter, 21 millimeter on a bolt, 22 on a nut. And because they come from Metric World, you're unlikely to get easy replacements, let's say at Napa Auto Parts, although the size of that hole you could fudge factor a little bit. But for this one, you're going to get 6 nuts in this 22 millimeter size in the kit. 4 of them are used for the whole spring mounting setup, and 2 are used here. The ones that you use here are the ones that have that little nylon liner. That's basically the little lock washer type deal that they have. And when you put this in, you don't crank it super tight. Just get it on there so it's down the shaft a bit, but you're not cranking this deadly tight. Okay, so I'm going to use the impact, but I got to take it easy on the impact. Okay, so this is one of the features they brought into the what they call the heavy duty trailer, which came from what they call the folding trailer, which is the whole tongue assembly can fold back. Now, it won't totally double over to the rear where it bumps into the axle, but it will get pretty far. So it's also what allows us to be basically a tilting trailer for unloading, let's say, quads and snowmobiles. Quads, motorcycles, snowmobiles, stuff like that. When I do this into a flatbed, I'll probably keep the tilting feature. And so what goes in these things are basically these large linch pins and some counter pins. So we're going to skip that at this point and deal with the hitch assembly, which is pretty tricky. It's basically a top plate and a bottom plate. They're going to go here. I'll swing these out and do it, but I don't have anyone holding the camera for me right now. And you can see how these things are triangle shaped, so they'll go opposite of each other. The thing I've run into that almost mandates a weld build on a lot of this is being able to reach in on the underside with a wrench. It's absolutely nearly impossible to get to the underside with a socket, so you're going to be impacting it from the outside. And on this, you pretty much I'll show you how I'm going to do it. And I'm going to do this as a bolt build just to do it to factory spec. But when I'm building these on my own, I'm probably going to reinforce it with weld later on. So this is how it'll look with everything kind of loosely on here. So the trick is that it's got a lot of movement to it, okay? And you want to just make sure that everything kind of balances in a symmetrical manner before you go tightening it down, because it can tweak its way right out if you are too aggressive on one bolt and haven't gotten to the others. The other thing is, because of the way the C-channel has that extra lip, it's a bitch to get a wrench to the underside to hold that when you're tightening the top end. And this is where I really like to just do weld all around here. But you got to make sure it goes symmetrical before you weld it. So you got to get a couple of bolts in before you weld it. You can see how up here things are really sensitive. So the factory welds go all the way through. They go all the way through. There's another piece that's going to cap onto that, and I'm going to show you some ways to reinforce it. But while it's not on here, I'll show you where I've seen stress failures on these in the past on other people's trailers, but not mine, is where this bend was right here. And right here was where it would start to pop out and stretch out, and then the metal would actually rip here. And that was a stress fracture on another guy's trailer. He had the same make and model. And so if this is an area to reinforce, I'm going to show you how to reinforce that. If you think you're going to be doing some loads that might be kind of pushing the limit of what this thing's capable of hauling. So the hitch assembly is this. It's pretty good. It's pretty complete. It bolts onto here. You'll have to undo the chain. The chain kind of comes on those bolts, and that's just a tricky thing. I'll show as much as I can in the video, but you're gonna end up figuring that out. And what I did on mine prior to this on a weld build is I welded the chain to the outside. Notice that this bottom plate is not powder coated, so you can weld on that. And so I attach a safety chain to the outside, and I might do that on this one. If you really, you want to have the welding done, you can go on your local Craigslist gigs, somebody's going to be available to do that. I'll show how to bolt it on. The problem is that it causes a few little problems with the length of the chain, and I'll show you how that works. Okay, so proper here is you get this chain where you get the links figured out at about halfway down the chain, right? You put this on here, you feed this through there, and you attach it, you put the nut on this end and tighten it down. I can't do it while I'm holding the camera, so we'll see that in a second. Alright, so 19 millimeter here, 18 on a bolt. So it's 19 on a nut, 18 on a bolt. They apparently want the chain to be on the underneath of this. And the problem I have with that is, with the chain coming out here, it can interfere with all your hitch ball mechanism and hooking stuff up, and over time something can get dinked out of shape and it becomes a problem. So I really, prefer mounting the chain. Let's say drill a hole in here, mount it here. I'm putting it here more or less temporarily. The problem is that it also interferes with this little locking mechanism, so you'd have to grind that bolt down either way. And what I'm probably going to do is, after I've built this and after I've made a video, I'm going to go around and reinforce this with weld. If you're building it, you want to do it the way they say, is this is going to flip around and the chain's going to be on the inside. I just personally don't like it that way, because it can cause problems later on down the road. So, make your own adult decisions when you're building this. But this is basically all bolted together, and then as long as you do it where it's symmetrical, when you put everything together, you should be okay. If you're going to reinforce this with weld, what you want to do is grind along here, get some fresh metal under that powder coating, and bridge that gap and get this part welded to that plate and that plate welded to the beam. And you're going to beat any of those issues that have come along with other people's units where they had a stress fracture come apart. I've never seen or heard of the bolts popping off, but it can get loose and rattly, and you prevent that looseness and rattleness with welding it. Okay, cheap stick welder will do everything you need to do. And so with this, we check and make sure it's symmetrical by flipping it down and making sure that everything goes into place where it should. We've got, okay, it came down on there. That's not a problem. But basically all these holes are going to line up where they should so that we can use those cross beams to lock that in. Next stage is going to be the axles. That goes relatively quickly. Okay, so next stage on here, we're going to be putting the axle together. And so the way the springs work is they hook up just at the front. Okay, at the back, it's got to have room for movement. So when you put the bolts through here, we put the nuts on. Try to get a little more consistent light. We'll look at it on this side. And then there's holes in the nuts for the collar pins. Okay. I'm going to come back here with a little hammer or something, make sure the collar pins are hammered through. You're never going to be getting that apart, but it's going to look loose. Okay, so you're not torquing this down because it needs to have a little bit of movement, a little bit of wiggle. That's just to keep this spring from popping out this way. Okay, and so the front one's connected, the rear one's kind of floating. And that's the way that's intended to be done. So you don't crank these down, just pass the bolt through. There's a little polymer bushing in there, and that's how that's going to work. When the axle sets on here, and when you look at the spring set, there's a pin that goes all the way through your leaf springs. It sticks out on both sides. I think on the other side it was both. This side it was like a little larger, kind of like a large rivet. And then on the other side, just a little nut, and that's just how it was done from the factory. And then there's a little keeper here. There's a corresponding hole on the axle pad here, so that just kind of lines up right there. And you set these two things on here, the two U-bolts, and then the plate goes on underneath. Now, what happens with this plate, you'll notice that it's not perfectly square, right? So we're going to orient that so that these just kind of go through gently. You shouldn't have to force anything. This is going to go with the other side of that large pin on the bottom side of the leaf spring, or what will be the top side of the leaf spring. And so here's how it looks put in. And you've got to pretty much just do this with You can do it with a regular socket wrench. I use one of the gear wrenches. You can't get in there with the impact very well because of the shape of everything you're dealing with. And you're going to use the same type of nuts that you're using on the body. I size it all to be that same metric one with the self-locking stuff. The difference is you want to crank it down pretty tight, but not super killer tight, because it will likely kind of shift a little bit once that trailer's had a couple loads on it. You might want to retorque those later on, because they got to be tight. What some people may want to do on these is go and put a second nut on or something, just to make sure that never comes off. But that's basically what our next stage is. And once this is together, we're going to be a little tricky with regards to getting the wheels on, because we don't want to just jam these up. The wheel nuts for the hubs, they come on these things to protect us. So the next stage will involve flipping the trailer over or doing this sideways and getting the wheels on. And we're going to do the rest of the work with the trailer right side up. Okay, next stage, you'll need to jack this up a little bit. I want to lift this corner to put a block under it so I'd have clearance to put the first tire on. We take the nut off right here. We kind of set that on the side. And when I want to do this, what I run into is you realize until some sort of a structure is put on these trailers, the frame is not super rigid, okay? So with the 2x4 sitting there, if you pick up one corner of this, you see how much that trailer flexes. That becomes an issue until you do a little more reinforcement or structure adding onto the trailer. Doing a weld build will stiffen the trailer frame. That's basically welding all of the joints instead of the bolts. But if you're going to use this thing off-road, and what I discussed a little bit in some other videos about bug-out trailers, you may want the frame to remain flexible. But that means a lot of screws and bolts for holding other things to it. And as you add things to the trailer, it becomes more and more stiff. Like decking will stiffen up the trailer a bit. But what you can't do on these successfully when you are, because it's so flexible, is riveting. There's too much movement for rivets to hold unless you have a welded structure for the riveted parts to go onto. When I was building one of these early on, I had a piece of metal that I used as decking. I riveted that metal in place and the rivets were popping on me. And that's because the whole frame flexes and that will pop rivets. At least normal aluminum pop rivets. If you were to use steel rivets, probably they would hold. But aluminum rivets aren't going to hold because of the flexibility on the frame. So next stage, I'm going to put that wheel on. I'm going to find another block to kind of hold up both ends, just to have enough clearance to put the wheel on upside down. And then I'll be flipping the trailer frame over. Got to get some help for that, and all the rest of it will be right side up. So what's new to me on this is these caps were hammered in place, and the reason is because this all has bearing grease. It's pre-lubed, and I was looking for the cotter pins because this is held in with the nut and the cotter pin. That's actually all stored inside of there. So when you pop, you got to pry this out. These are hammered in place. I use the end of a crowbar thing here to get that out. So these, they're full of grease. We want to set them somewhere clean right now. Make sure the bearing's been oriented correctly. Just make sure that grease goes into there. And like I said, a really good upgrade for this is if you replace these with the version that has a grease fitting, so you can pump it full of grease. That helps deal with any issues, any imperfections here. I'm going to take a little bit and just kind of pre-lube things here because I'm going to be sliding that on. I just want it to slide on smoothly without catching any paint. These are welded. If you need to grind or sand or file any weld slag there, you could. But the other thing would be to take this in to either back to your Harbor Freight or your Napa Auto Parts store and replace it with one that has the grease fitting on it. So I'll be lifting this into place. It's not very heavy, so you know, one person can do it. I'm going to slide it on very gently, make sure the bearing doesn't come out, make sure the bearings are oriented properly. It should just be the way it came from the factory. Okay, don't pull it out and flip it around the other way. It's gotta be in just like that, just like you see in the video. We'll stick that on there now. Okay, so in tightening this on, we're not trying to power torque it heavily, but it's going to force its way in, and basically you need this castle nut to go on to the point where all of the threads are engaged, and then you've got a little bit sticking out. So use this video as a reference point for how far that needs to go in. You should have full movement here, and then keep an eye on the lug nuts here. You'll notice there's a little gap here. This lug nut isn't really squared on, so I'm going to be loosening and retightening these after I have everything together, even though they come pre-installed. And the tire come pre-inflated too. It's a very high pressure tire. I believe these are like 80 psi, so you got to keep that in mind for fuel economy and load bearing issues. But basically we tighten this all the way down, and then you're going to loosen it back and make absolutely certain we're trying to keep everything clean here. You don't want to do this in a real dirty environment. That no grit, no grime. I'm even wiping off the wrench before I put it on here. We're going to loosen it back up to the point that I expose the holes so I can get my cotter pin in there. And usually it faces front to rear, but we're going to loosen this just slightly to expose the hole for the cotter pin. There, we can see it right there. I've got good even movement, so we're not having a problem with that. And then I'm going to find the cotter pin. Doesn't really matter a whole lot whether it goes rear to front or front to rear, but we need it to go in all the way. Everything here has to go in all the way, but I'm going to go and grab a real tool for this and basically drive it in. We drive it out, and we bend back the little ears on a cotter pin, and then that stays. Okay, so some people like to see the little ears on the cotter pin tweaked all the way back to where they'll never move. Personal preference on that. I like to leave a little bit of room so that I can get at those with a plier, pinch them back together, and get it out if I have to. So that's about the way I do it. The main thing you want to be looking at is to make sure that you clear everything for the reinstallation of this. And you can hammer it on with a regular hammer very gently, but it'll bend it up. So I'm going to go grab a heavy rubber mallet and smack that on place, and then that's basically installed. Okay, with the hubs on and the trailer flipped over, we would have yet to go with the fenders, which I'm not going to install. But generally speaking, you've got holes here. You're going to use the same bolts that you're using to assemble the frame. They would go into the rear holes, not the front ones, the rear ones over here, and just bolts right into that. And then the top ones will support the steel fenders. I'm going to be saving weight and not using those. I'm also going to be expanding out the bed of the trailer. Now, the reason they call this a tilting trailer is because of the way that tongue folds up. Now, I haven't put those linch pins in there, but here you can see it sitting on the ground. There's another way of putting a cartwheel at the front that folds down, or a folding tongue. But if you need to load one of these, let's say snowmobile ATV style, which is part of the original design on these, or lightweight small farm equipment in China, is I can just step on this and you can see how this folds up. So if it remained hitched to a vehicle, you could simply fold that down if it were remaining hitched to a vehicle, and you would be able to drive something or push something onto it. And that's obviously variable, so you can do that. It's not truly a dump bed, but if you do pull the pins on those and start pushing the back down, it can make it a little easier to unload, let's say, a load of dirt or something like that. Your cargo capacity, I would say, you know, even though they say it's 1 ton, it's basically equal to a small pickup truck. And then the next series of videos will deal with the electrical system and converting this to a flatbed. A real flatbed, not just a 4x8 flatbed. Part of that's going to involve looking out for the wheel travel. The fenders don't need to be as high up, as far from the tires as this factory specification calls on these. Your range of movement is basically this distance right here. That's the range of movement on your suspension. If it bumps up any higher than that, obviously it's running into the frame and you've probably overloaded the trailer. So that's basically what you need for reaching above the frame here. There's a little bit going on, maybe 1.5 inches here, and then plus this is what you can get away with. So in making this a flatbed that's slightly larger than what we would have as a 4x8, I'll deal with that in a little separate series. But this is the assembly video for the mechanical parts of the Harbor Freight heavy-duty 5-lug trailer with the 12-inch tires, and that's a 12-inch rim. I think the tires themselves go a little closer to 16, 17 inches by the time we're done with, you know, the end-to-end on the rubber.